Hi, everyone. Today we'll be continuing to look at gender and how it relates to social institutions. We'll begin with a recap of how gender ties into the institution of work, and then we'll continue today by looking at two additional institutions, education and sport. So I wanted to talk about education and sport, although a little bit briefly, but at least talk about them in reference to gender, because I do believe they are strong, powerful institutions when it comes to the creation of gender and gender socialization. So before we turn our attention to education and sport, and with sport, we'll be looking at our 10th in class assignment. Just a brief recap of the institution of work. We talked about how it relates excuse me, how it represents a gendered institution. As a gendered institution, we talked about her and his labor. So, jobs we feminize and we expect women to perform that type of labor, and the jobs we masculinize, and in doing so, we expect men to perform that type of labor. So, with that sex segregation, we can also look at work as a gendered institution regarding hidden labor. Hidden labor can be seen in two different ways. First, how often men's jobs are in the kind of front stage area, while on the other hand, a lot of women's work, the her labor, is more in the background area. The jobs are vital to the organization running, but still they're kind of in the background where the jobs go unseen and unrecognized. And often when your work goes unseen and unrecognized, it doesn't get its proper value. You don't get your proper due. The second way we can look at hidden labor is with respect to how a lot of women have to perform on top of their duties and responsibilities of their work. They also perform emotional labor, trying to manage the emotions of coworkers, trying to listen to their coworkers be emotional. So again, it's additional work that you're doing, trying to make people feel better, trying to help people out with their problems, but it's work that's not necessarily part of your formal responsibilities. Work that you're doing, but you shouldn't be doing, work that you're doing and you're not getting paid for. So we can look at work as a gendering institution when we look at how socialization takes place when people do enter the her and his type of labor. So when you start to enter the female type labor, you have to perform the femininity that comes with the role. And when you enter the male type labor, you perform the masculinity that comes with the role. But as I mentioned before, we do have to be careful here to directly tie the gendered behavior to the person, because often it's not a reflection of the person that we see, but rather the gender behavior is a reflection of the job itself. So if your job dictates that you be nurturing, then we're going to see that nurturing behavior. If your job dictates that you're going to be bossing people around, then that's the type of behavior you're going to see based upon your job. You're trying to boss people, you're trying to manage people. Then we also talked about pre-work socialization. So socialization that goes on in the family, goes on at schools, that kind of trains formally, informally people to go into the her and his type of labor. So some of this gendering process that continues later on in life in the institution of work actually starts much earlier than you enter your careers. It starts at school, it starts in our family. And finally, we can look at work policies that sometimes push men into the public realm and push women into the private realm in terms of taking time off to take care of children, so on and so on. So, again, you're kind of pushing people into the gender type jobs when you have policies that allow women to go home, but those same policies cannot be applied to men going home. And so finally, we can look at the promotion of inequality between the sexes, wage gaps when it comes to the her and his type of labor. Typically, his type of labor pays more compared to the her. Also, the wage gap when it comes to people performing the same type of labor. So even if the person's in the same job, no matter be a her or his job, men are typically making more money when compared to women doing the same type of work. Advancement, we talked about the glass ceiling that women encounter and the glass escalator that men get to ride when men are working in female typed work. And finally, we talked about gender beliefs about financial responsibilities. So again, often consciously, unconsciously, when it comes to negotiation of wages, negotiation for a salary, or trying to think of who's getting promoted or not, often it's people believe that men are not only taking care of themselves financially, but they're responsible for other people as well, whether it be their partner or whether it be their kids. And on the other hand, typically women are not seen to be financially responsible for other people. Often they're seen to be taken care of by other people financially, whether it be their partner or their own parent or parents. I think many of us, probably all of us, can think back to recent experiences or to past experiences back in grade school or middle school and kind of recognize how the institution of education definitely can be seen as something that is, gendering, and it ties into the promotion of inequality between the sexes as well. So, as a gendered institution, again, we can talk about that, separation aspect, how the sexes are often separated from one another, whether it be into different classroom settings, formally, informally. This could be done. I know when I was in junior high, girls were persuaded to take home economics while the boys were persuaded to take industrial arts. And then other times the separation is more formal where you have different locker rooms, different activities perhaps in your PE classes, different restrooms, and then different sports and stuff, kind of the institution within the institution aspect. We'll get into sport here in a second. So definitely see this separation of the sexes go on. And sometimes, again, it's not by the institution mandating that you go into one locker room or another, but often informally there's a separation that students do amongst themselves. So whether it be kind of where you hang out and with whom during a breakage between class periods, where you're eating lunch, where you're hanging out perhaps on the playground. A lot of this is very sex segregated in terms of with whom people are, socializing, and often it's segregated more often than not by sex, more so than other variables. So you can see the separation of the sexes going on within schools, informally and formally. And then also there's a lot of research on her and his academics. Now, again, this kind of starts earlier, more informally, where sometimes teachers on grade school, middle school levels will try to encourage the sexes to go into the gender type occupations. So, for example, a lot more women are encouraged to pursue their artistic desires, while men, on the other hand, are kind of not really encouraged to pursue art. Oh, you're a guy, you're not supposed to be good at art. So even though perhaps the guy, liked art, he found it interesting, he may be likely to give it up and to pursue something else. And we see this with, other topics such as math, where men are often encouraged to go into math, try harder at math, again, often unconsciously by teachers. They don't even know they're doing it. But when you actually do the research, you see that women are less encouraged at the high school, at the middle school, grade school levels to really pursue math and take it seriously compared to how the teachers treat the boys and the younger men as they go through their formal education. So, that kind of ties into later on where at colleges, disproportionately, you start to see men in the natural sciences, where disproportionately you start to see women go into the social sciences and other areas of education, such as education itself, men going into engineering. So you see this kind of her and his academics. Again, it starts more informally earlier, but it formalizes itself later on when people get to choose their majors as they go through their college experience. So, in addition to kind of the separation of the sexes, the gendered aspect of education, we can look at how it's gendering, the socialization process going on to socialize the sexes in masculine and feminine ways. So, here we look at how individuals are exposed to understandings of the sexes. So, again, it starts at a very kind of young age when we begin to enter formal education. We learn, whether it be directly or indirectly, that girls are supposed to look and act a certain way, boys are supposed to look and act in other ways, and so you're exposed to this culture that perhaps even at home, if your parents or if your parent treating you more in kind of gender neutral ways, you start to recognize that things are much different when you step out of your private home space into the public school spaces. And so when you're exposed to this culture repeatedly, the space also operates to socialize you in that gendered manner. And so when you learn the how, in terms of how to act, how to look, people are socialized to act and look accordingly to the gender expectations. And again, sometimes a teacher is actually doing this. Again, they're not maybe intentionally trying to gender you, but the bottom line is the same. And then your fellow students, and a lot of the research here calls this peer policing. Your fellow students will kind of hold you accountable for staying within those gender boundaries. So finally, we can look at the promotion of inequality. When you kind of look at the her and his academics, again, we start to see a lot of the money being made, a lot of the careers are higher in pay, higher in status for the his academics compared to the her academics. And we can also look at, again, kind of more informally, how we can see inequality being promoted where throughout one's academic career, starting at that grade school level throughout high school, and maybe decreasing a little bit once you get to college, but we can look at least to through high school how formal education kind of rewards people differently in terms of allocating you social status. So often men will achieve their social status through their sense of accomplishment at sports. So you can be a good athlete and you'll get social status as a result. Other times, it's a sense of somebody being kind of a cool kid. So one's coolness is kind of rewarded socially. So you may not be an athlete, but people kind of see you as being somebody who is kind of into interesting things, whether it be your music or other tastes that you have. So, the coolness, the athletics allow boys kind of a path to achieve the social status, kind of, what you do, who you are. But when it comes to girls achieving social status, it has less to do with kind of what you do as an athlete, or less to do in terms of your taste that you possess. Often it's more about how you look. So again, this objectification that we've talked about, rather than being the kind of subject that we see for men, holds true here. Again, that path to status. So women are kind of elevated to a higher status in school when it comes to your looks, when it comes to your attractiveness, how people like you in terms of a romantic intention. And so you could be cool, you could be humorous, you could be a great athlete, but those attributes don't provide women the same returns in terms of getting higher social status that those variables of being funny, being cool, or being a good athlete provide the boys in terms of getting a higher social status compared to their peers. We have looked at sport previously As an institution, with respect to gender, whether it be in the Mesner article or we've had conversations about sport in terms of providing spaces in which the sexes can perform the kind of unexpected genders and actually get away with it. And we'll talk about that again shortly. So, when looking at sport as an institution, this will tie into our 10th in class assignment. And we can say that we can look at the gender culture being produced both on and off the field within the institution of sport. So young boys, young men, they learn, or I guess we can say first they're exposed to this culture of how they're supposed to, play hard, play like men. They're supposed to, dominate others, and you're not supposed to care about your body. You're not supposed to care about your physical health. So we talked about this before with the gendered body as well. So you kind of introduced to this culture where, again, you put your body on the line for the sport, you put your body on the line for the team. You're supposed to dominate your competition, and you're supposed to, play hard, play like men. So there's this culture of kind of hyper aggression, hyper competition, and overall kind of hyper masculinity, and that you're exposed to when you start to play sports. Then also we can see with respect to a culture of femininity within sport, often what you see is the objectification of female athletes. So often what you see in terms of the objectification is when you look at male athletes, typically you see them and their presence in our culture, whether it be on TV, in magazines, usually see them based upon their merit, how well they do, how well their team does. And when you look at female athletes, they're good athletes, but typically what you see is the female athlete not in terms of their merit, but in terms of their physical attractiveness. So, in other words, oftentimes it's not the best athlete in women's sports that gets the most attention, but often it's the best looking female athlete in female sports that gets the most attention. So, when looking at the socialization process, the boys, the young men begin to learn this gender culture. How you're supposed to, give it your all, supposed to be tough, dominate others, and you're not supposed to care about your body. And then also you start to learn and internalize the objectification of the female athlete. And this goes on with both, women and men, how they're exposed to men playing sports, based upon kind of their merit. And you're kind of exposed and re-exposed to women as the objects. There's been a lot of interesting research on this where the athletes being on a cover of a magazine, what are they wearing? How are they posing? And the female athlete is much more likely to be sexualized compared to the male athlete. So you start to see this gender culture being produced within sport, the socialization within that culture. But also we can talk about how it is a unique institution because it allows people to cross gender boundaries without consequences. So in other words, as we talked about before, guys can display intimacy with other guys, and guys can display those soft emotions, when they're doing it for the team, when they win or lose a big game. And they're not called girls, their man card is not taken away. Likewise, when you look at women, playing aggressive, being competitive, being assertive, traits we typically associate with masculinity in men, when women are performing those traits on the field, on the court, then they can get away with it compared to if they're performing those same traits in the classroom or in the place of work. Sometimes they're seen as unfeminine, and sometimes they're seen as being manly in their actions. So although you do see that cultural production and socialization going on, we can also see how it is a degendered experience often for the athletes where they can do the sport and kind of do the masculinity without kind of saying that she's not a real woman. And you can do the sport and do what we perceive to be the femininity, and again, not having your man card taken away from you. And we can also look at sports as an institution as another site of the separation of the sexes. And this ties into her and his sports. So basically, sports that we consider to be for girls and women, and sports we consider to be for boys and boys and men. And although sometimes it can be the same sport, we can still say it's a gendered sport. So, as an example of this, we can say that cheerleading is a sport that is done by both women and men, but we consider cheerleading to be kind of a feminine sport, so we type it as a female sport. So we have these sports that are for her or for him, and then we separate the sexes into those spaces. And even when people are playing the same sports, often we impose different rules on the different sexes. So if you're playing basketball, not all people play basketball the same. We have one set of rules for women and another set of rules for men. And the same thing with uniforms. So even when you're playing the same sport, often we will dress the individuals differently based upon their sex. So playing the same sport will dress women differently compared to how men are supposed to dress. So this last part here, the sex separation, this will tie directly into the in-class assignment. For the in-class assignment, we'll be looking at how, as an institution, sport operates to organize and separate the sexes into different spaces. And even when playing the same sport, we still find ways to differentiate the two sexes by imposing different rules on them and imposing different uniforms on them when they're playing the same game. So what I want you to do is for 1, 2, and 3, the her and his sports, the different rules when playing the same game, and different uniforms when playing the same game, I want you to come up with 2 examples of each. So for the first one, there'll be a total of 4 examples. So 2 sports you consider to be gendered for women, so kind of her sports, and 2 example sports you consider to be for him, for men. And then we get into the next one here, come up with 2 examples of sports where there are different rules imposed upon the sexes when they're playing the same game. And then also you can look at 2 examples for the last one, again when playing the same game, how we have people wear different uniforms based upon if they're women or if they're men.